Hello and welcome to set of slides number 4.1 of the second week. We are now, we're here going to look at the organization Peace Now, called in Hebrew Shalom Achshav and in Arabic Salam Al-An. This organization was established in 1978, and in this first presentation we're looking at the period 78-84. In the next one we're going to look at the period 87-93, which corresponds roughly to the period of the first Intifada. Let me start by saying that, as I'm sure you all know, Peace Now is not an organization of conscientious objectors, and in fact it doesn't advocate for conscientious objector. What is important of Peace Now is that it's probably the most famous Israeli peace movement, not pacifist, but peace movement. Certainly the longest, the one that has been existing for longer, I would say now. Although, as we have seen in one of the very first slides, peace movements remind the image of the tail of the whale that swims and disappears and then reappears to exist on and off. So Peace Now, despite the fact that it can claim continuity between 78 and today, has had, let's say, moments of visibility which are greater, and others that are in which the movement was less visible or had less of an impact. So let's start from the beginning. Peace Now was established in 1978 at a very particular moment, which is during the Israeli-Egyptian peace talks of 1978, in fact. As you know, Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, offered to come to Jerusalem to explore avenues to make peace, and with Prime Minister Menachem Begin, at some point there were talks for signing a peace agreement with Egypt. At some point the peace talks were stalled, and a group of 348 reserve officers and soldiers from the IDF and combat units in particular published an open letter to the Prime Minister calling upon the government to make sure that the opportunity for peace was not lost. 250,000 Israelis signed in support of the letter, and this is how the movement was born. Here you have the original of the letter. Now, there is a translation in the next slide, and I'm going to outline for you just a few important points. In particular, I think we should highlight the central paragraph. But before doing that, let's read the first one. Dear Sir, citizens that also serve as soldiers and officers in the reserve forces are sending this letter to you. First sentence. So first of all, these are not total conscientious objectors. These are officers, in fact, that claim. That base their legitimacy of this letter on the fact that they serve in the army. They continue, at this time when new horizons of peace and cooperation are for the first time being proposed to the State of Israel, we feel obliged to call upon you to prevent taking any steps that could cause endless problems to our people and our state. In other words, no reasons are really valid to stop talking with someone who has offered his hand in peace. And then this is the central paragraph. We are writing with deep anxiety as a government that prefers the existence of the State of Israel within the borders of Greater Israel to its existence in peace with good neighborliness will be difficult for us to accept. A government that prefers existence of settlements beyond the Green Line to elimination of this historic conflict with creation of normalization of relationships in our region will evoke questions regarding the path we are taking. A government policy that will cause a continuation of control over 1 million Arabs will hurt the Jewish democratic character of the state and will make it difficult for us to identify with the path of the State of Israel. So basically, I remember that Menachem Begin was elected as prime minister as head of the right-wing party Likud. Likud was elected for the first time in government as majority party in the government in 1977. So that's the year before this letter is being written. And it is well known that the ideology of the right-wing parties in Israel was different from that of the Labour Party in many respects, and certainly the question of the Greater Israel and of the settlements beyond the Green Line were two central points that the soldiers and officers of the reserve did not want to be invoked as excuses for not signing or not proceeding further in the talks for a peace agreement. So here we have the refusal of the ideology of the Greater Israel, for one. Second, the existence of the settlement as a problem, which is the second point. And the third is the continuation of the occupation, basically, of the control over 1 million Arabs, which is expressed not so much for the good of the Palestinians, which are under occupation, but as something that corrupts the moral fiber of the democracy, of the Jewish democratic character of the state, as they phrase it. And here it says, we officers will not identify with such a choice, with such a path. So these 348 signatures, as we said, were supported by 25,000 citizens who felt that these views were also theirs. And this is how the movement was born. And I think it's important to just have a look at a couple of graphs. These were taken from the book that you have listed in your bibliography, David Hall Katala, the Israeli peace movement from 67 to 87. And of course, peace now is one of the main actors, one of the central points of this book. So these are just pictures that I've taken from this book, and you can here see various kind of demonstrations that peace now promoted between 78 and 79 first. These are not many demonstrations, but the first line has to do with demonstrating against the policy of the Likud in the occupied territory. And as you can see, there is a small box where it says post Camp David break, give begging a chance. That's when the letter that I just read to you and that we've just commented was drafted. And these graphs indicate the number of people that the organization was able to mobilize at given moments. As you can see in the next slide, in the next picture, the number of people that the organization was able to mobilize at the end of the 1970s and until April 1980 was grew in numbers and in the number of causes that the organization started to support and defend, and it's interesting to see that while the against Likud policy kind of demonstration were the majority of the demonstration of Peace Now. At the end of April 1980, we have here the negotiations with Sadat in support of the Camp David process. And as you can see, the number of people that are being mobilized reaches even almost 100,000 people, which for Israel is quite a large number. And the kind of mobilization that follows increases in terms of number, if we look in terms of number and participation, and therefore the popularity of the movement. If we look at what happens in the first 3 years of the 1980s, of course we have in 1982 the beginning of the Lebanon War, the Israeli invasion into Lebanon, and that's one of those key points that really sparked off a very large movement of protest in Israel that involved new organizations of conscientious objectors, new committees, new organizations. It was a sort of a moment where the Israeli society started to protest against war, against violence, against a war that was not perceived to be as necessary nor as defensive, but a war of choice rather than of necessity. So you can see here the number of participation and mobilization that increases and that reaches its peak with the demonstrations against, in the immediate aftermath of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, and the following moments when an inquiry committee, a parliamentary committee of inquiry, the Kahan Commission, was set up to investigate on the responsibilities of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which was one, in fact, of the requests of Peace Now. And the mobilization of sympathizers and members of the organization for demonstrations, it's also quite high when we have not only people protesting Sabra and Shatila and assumption of responsibilities, but also following the findings of the Kahane Commission on the responsibilities on Sabra and Shatila, demonstrations that required Ariel Sharon and others to resign as responsible, indirectly responsible for the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. And here we have the last image that I've taken from the book of David Hall Katala, that are also various demonstrations against the Likud for their policy in the occupied territories, but also against the war in Lebanon. So let's look at just 1 second at the beginning of the 1980s to see that, first of all, let's say that the Lebanon War provoked a number, as I said, of demonstrations and the foundations of a number of peace committees and protest committees, which is different. But Peace Now was not the only, was not the first, Israeli peace group to demonstrate against the war, but it was the group that managed to mobilize the most people, and in this way it became the organization that articulated the whole of the protest against the Lebanon war. But it could not, Peace Now could not claim to be expressing the public consensus against the war, especially because there was a very, very strong and vociferous support for Begin and Sharon, including the attack against the demonstration of Peace Now that caused, with a hand grenade, that caused the death of one of the protesters, Emil Grunzweig, in 1983. So the polarization of Israeli society seemed very, very strong at that point. And I would direct you to a book by Michael Feige, which is listed in your bibliography, most likely for week number 4, which is entitled One Space, Two Nations, and talks about the polarization of the public space between two opposing ideologies, that of represented by Peace Now, so that of the protest, the objection to the Greater Israel, the not missing a chance for making peace, and the ideology of the settlers of settling beyond the Green Line, in fact, and of using violence to stop those who protested and thought otherwise. However, in this wave, Peace Now appeared to be, with the whale tail up, if you want, appeared to be an effective social movement in pressing for peace and opposing war. This was not always the case, and in the next set of slides we will look at some strategies of Peace Now from this moment onwards, and how they articulated both what we've seen as the Galtung method that I've briefly sketched out in one of the first slides, the deconstructive, dissociation part, so deconstructing enmity, but also the association part, that is building bridges with the other. So if you follow me to the next set of slides, we'll look at more in detail at some of the campaigns of Peace Now for the following few years. Thank you very much.